Tackling something, welcome back to the deep dive. Today, we're tackling something pretty ambitious.
You could say that. We're looking at the foundations, the actual texts of
Yeah.
Judaism, Christianity, and Islam.
Right. The Torah, the New Testament, the Quran. But our mission here is maybe a bit different. We're not really debating theology today.
No, not at all. This is more like textual forensics.
Exactly. Forensics. We want to figure out what these texts literally said, before all the layers of interpretation got added.
And how reliably were those original words passed down? That's crucial.
Absolutely. How much did time, human editing, maybe even politics, shape the final documents we have now?
It's a fascinating question. And to get at it, we really need to keep track of two main ideas, I think.
Okay, what are those?
First, there's the simple chronological gap. How much time passed between the prophet or central figure living and speaking and the moment their words were sort of locked down in a final official text?
Makes sense. The time lag.
Yeah. And that lag directly influences the second idea, what we could call the logical margin of error for misrepresentation.
Okay, unpack that a bit. Margin of error.
Well, the longer the time gap or the more chaotic the transmission process, the greater the chance for things to get changed, misunderstood, or even intentionally edited to fit a later agenda. It's just logical, really.
Got it. So the gap impacts the potential for drift from the original message.
Precisely.
Okay, let's apply that. Let's start with the Torah, the first 5 books of the Hebrew Bible. Moses is the central figure, traditionally dated when?
Traditionally, somewhere around 1400 to 1200 BCE, a long time ago.
Right. And the final text, the one scholars study today, when did that take shape?
Well, that's where the gap really becomes apparent. The scholarly consensus puts the final writing, the final redaction or editing, much later, around the 5th century BCE.
Wait, 5th century BCE, so between Moses and the final text we're looking
A
at.
huge gap, somewhere between 700 and 900 years.
Wow. That's nearly millennium.
It is. And scholars generally believe that this long period allowed for different traditions during source documents to be woven together.
Ah, is that the JEDP thing I've read about?
Exactly. Those letters represent what scholars see as distinct sources or strands of tradition that were combined and edited over many, many centuries, often reflecting concerns from much later periods.
So multiple layers of human input over a vast stretch of time.
That's the scholarly view, yes. Though it's important to note the traditional Jewish perspective is quite different. It holds that Moses himself wrote it under divine inspiration, meaning from that viewpoint, the margin of error is essentially zero.
Okay, point taken. 2 very different views on that gap. Now, let's shift gears. The New Testament. Jesus is roughly 4 BCE to 33 CE. How does its timeline compare?
It's dramatically shorter. Much, much shorter.
How short? When did the first writings appear?
The earliest accepted writings are Paul's letters, and they date to around 50 to 62 CE.
So what, maybe 20 to 30 years after Jesus' ministry ended?
That's right. Potentially within the lifetime of people who actually witnessed the events. That's a key difference.
And the Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, John.
They come a bit later, but still relatively close. Generally dated between, say, 60 and 100 CE. So still within about 70 years of the events for the latest ones.
Okay, so definitely a much tighter time frame than the Torah's centuries-long gap.
Absolutely.
But then we get to the Quran. How does that fit in?
The Quran's timeline is, well, unique in its brevity. Prophet Muhammad received revelations over a period from about 610 CE to his death in 632 CE.
Okay, so a 22-year period of revelation.
Yes. And here's the striking part. The first major effort to compile and standardize the text into what's known as the Uthmanic Codex.
The definitive version.
Essentially, yes. That happened very quickly after Muhammad's death, between 632 and about 656 CE.
So within maybe 24 years of the last revelation.
Exactly. It's an incredibly short gap compared to the others. This rapid compilation, combined with a strong tradition of memorization by Muhammad's companions, the Hafiz.
The memorizers.
Yes, that combination is seen as a major factor in limiting the time available for significant textual changes or corruption to creep in.
Okay, so we have these 3 distinct gaps. Huge for the Torah, moderate for the New Testament, and very small for the Quran.
That's a good summary.
So now let's connect that back to your logical margin of error. How does the size of the gap translate into the potential for the text to diverge from the original message? Let's start with the Torah again, that 700-900-year gap.
Right. From a purely textual critical standpoint, that long gap involving multiple sources and editors over centuries, suggests a potentially high margin for, let's call it, editorial shaping.
What do you mean by shaping? Not just errors.
Not necessarily just accidental errors, no. More like the selection of materials, the way they're arranged, the theological points that are emphasized. These might reflect the priorities and the context of the final editors, perhaps during the Babylonian exile, as much as, or even more than, the context of Moses' time. Some scholars might put that potential divergence as high as 30 to 50% in terms of reflecting later concerns.
Okay, so it's about emphasis and perspective shaped by later events.
That's a big part of the scholarly discussion, yes.
Now, the New Testament. The gap is smaller, but you mentioned a low to moderate margin, maybe 10 to 40% for verbatim precision. But I've heard figures like hundreds of thousands of variations in manuscripts. How does that square?
Ah, yes, the variance.
Yeah.
That number, sometimes cited as 200,000 or even 400,000, sounds enormous, doesn't it?
It sounds like the text is incredibly unstable.
It sounds that way, but it's crucial to understand what those variants are. The vast, vast majority are incredibly minor things.
Like what?
Spelling differences, remember, these were copied by hand. Different word order in Greek, which often doesn't change the meaning. Accidental omission of a word, or adding a small explanatory word, things like that.
So not changes to core beliefs.
Overwhelmingly, no. When textual critics analyze these, they find that the core message, who Jesus was, the meaning of his death and resurrection, the call to faith, is remarkably consistent across the manuscript tradition, despite all these minor surface variations. The 10–40% reflects more the challenge of pinning down the exact original wording in every single case, given the copying and translation process into Greek, Latin, Syriac, etc.
I see. So lots of tiny ripples, but the main shape of the pool is clear.
That's a good analogy.
Okay. And then the Quran, with its very short gap.
The margin of error for the original Arabic text itself is considered very low by textual scholars, maybe in the range of 1 to 2%.
1 to 2%. Why so low?
Again, it comes back to the speed and centralization of the initial collection under Uthman, and the parallel check provided by the large number of people who had memorized the text during Muhammad's lifetime. That combination created a strong mechanism against significant changes taking root early on.
Right. The speed and the memorization acting as controls.
Exactly. It drastically reduced the window of opportunity for major textual drift.
Okay, this is fascinating. We've got the containers, the texts, and a sense of their structural integrity based on how they were formed. Now let's look inside. If we try, just for a moment, to peel back all the later layers, the Talmud for Judaism, the creeds for Christianity, the Hadith for Islam, what do the earliest texts themselves literally say is the core message?
That's the next crucial step. Starting with the Torah, Genesis through Deuteronomy. What's the absolute core?
My reading suggests it's about a foundational covenant relationship between God and a specific people, and the comprehensive law given to govern that relationship and their society.
I think that's right. It establishes God as the creator, active in history, choosing a people, and giving them a detailed legal and ethical framework, the law, the 613 mitzvot or commandments. The focus is very much on the community and its relationship with God through obedience to this comprehensive law.
And that famous line, love your neighbor as yourself from Leviticus, that fits within this framework of the covenant community, right?
Yes. Traditionally understood as operating within that defined community bound by the covenant and the law. It's about ethical conduct within the chosen people.
Okay. Now, shift to the earliest New Testament text, the Gospels, Paul's early letters. Does the core message stay the same?
It shifts significantly, I'd say. While building on the Hebrew scriptures, the focus narrows intensely onto the person and role of Jesus.
How so?
The core message becomes about Jesus' identity as the Messiah, the Christ, and the idea that salvation comes through faith in him, specifically his death and resurrection. The emphasis moves from comprehensive national law to personal repentance and belief.
So the literal mandates change too, less about the 613 commandments and more.
More about things like repent, for the kingdom of heaven is at hand, as Matthew puts it. Love is still central, often framed as the supreme command, but salvation itself is tied directly to faith in Jesus. Ethical teachings, like the Sermon on the Mount, focus on inner transformation, humility, mercy, perhaps more than adherence to a detailed external legal code.
A different emphasis, definitely. Individual faith and the person of Jesus seem central.
Very much so.
And finally, the Quran. What's the irreducible core message there?
Absolute, uncompromising monotheism. Tawhid. That is the bedrock.
Explain Tawhid a bit more.
It's the absolute oneness and uniqueness of God, Allah. He has no partners, no offspring, no equals. He is the sole creator, sustainer, and judge. This theme permeates the entire Quran.
So the literal mandates flow from that.
Directly. Worship God alone, that's paramount. Accept Muhammad as the final messenger sent by God. Perform the prescribed acts of worship like prayer, salat, and charity, zakat. Live justly according to God's guidance, and constantly be aware of the coming day of judgment.
That verse from Surah 112 really sums it up, doesn't it? Say, He is God, the one and only, God, the eternal absolute. He begetteth not, nor is he begotten, and there is none like unto him.
Precisely. It's a profound statement of Tawhid.
So if we line up those three core messages, covenant law, Messiah faith, Tawhid submission, despite the differences, there seems to be some pretty significant common ground literally in the texts themselves, doesn't there?
Oh, absolutely. All three insist on monotheism at their core. All emphasize moral accountability before God. All stress justice. All believe God communicates through revelation. And all include concepts of divine judgment, reward, and punishment. That shared foundation is undeniable when you look at the primary texts.
Okay, but if that common ground is so strong in the original texts, where do the huge differences we see today come from? The distinct religions, the different practices, the conflicts, if it's not primarily from the foundational texts themselves.
Now we get to the really crucial part. The divergence, the distinct shape of each religion as practiced today seems to stem much more from the human interpretations that came after the texts were established.
The secondary bodies of writing.
Exactly. The Talmud, the church creeds and writings of the church fathers, the Islamic hadith collections and legal schools. These were human efforts over centuries to explain the core texts, apply their laws to new situations, and build theological systems. And this is where politics and power often entered the picture in a big way.
Okay, let's trace that influence. Take the Jewish interpretive tradition, the Mishnah, the Talmud. You mentioned they were crucial for survival.
They were. Think about the context. The Romans destroyed the Second Temple in Jerusalem in 70 CE. This was catastrophic. The center of Jewish religious and political life was gone.
So the religion needed a new anchor.
Precisely. The rabbis, through intense debate and scholarship compiled over centuries, created the Mishnah and then the Talmud. These weren't new scripture, but authoritative interpretations and applications of Torah law for every aspect of life. It essentially created a portable framework for Jewish identity and practice, a kind of legal intellectual homeland that could sustain the community in exile and the diaspora. It was a brilliant, necessary response to immense political pressure.
A legal structure born from political necessity.
In large part, yes.
Now, Christianity. The interpretive texts are things like the Nicene Creed. How did politics play a role there? You mentioned Emperor Constantine.
The link between Christian interpretation, particularly defining orthodoxy, and political power, became incredibly strong, especially with Constantine in the 4th century.
He convened the Council of Nicaea, right? 325 CE.
He did. And the Nicene Creed, which defined the nature of Christ and the Trinity, wasn't just a theological document. It was also a tool for imperial unity. Constantine wanted religious stability in his vast, often fractious empire. Theological disputes, especially about the nature of Jesus, were causing significant unrest.
So defining orthodoxy was a way to achieve political stability.
Absolutely. By backing the Nicene formulation with imperial authority, Constantine effectively linked correct belief, orthodoxy, with loyalty to the state. Dissenting views were suppressed not just as heresy, but often as challenges to imperial order. This set a powerful precedent for state involvement in defining Christian doctrine for centuries. The interpretive divergence rate scholars note may be 40–60% across denominations over time, partly reflects reactions to and breaks from this centralized, politically enforced interpretation.
Wow. So state power directly shaped the dominant interpretation.
Undeniably.
Okay, finally, Islam. The Quran itself had that low textual error margin. But what about the secondary interpretive texts, especially the Hadith?
This is where it gets complex again. The Hadith are reports about the Prophet Muhammad's sayings and actions. They're incredibly important for interpreting the Quran and forming Islamic law, Sharia. But they weren't compiled during Muhammad's lifetime or even immediately after, like the Quran.
Where were they collected?
The major, authoritative collections were compiled much later, mostly in the 9th century CE. That's about 150 to 250 years after Muhammad's death.
That's another significant time gap.
It is. And during that gap, vast numbers of reports circulated. Islamic scholars developed sophisticated methods to try and authenticate them, tracing chains of narrators. But the sheer volume tells a story. Some sources say scholars like Bukhari sifted through something like 600,000 reported traditions.
600,000.
And accepted only around 7,000 as authentic for his collection.
Right. Accepted 7,000 out of 600,000. That implies.
It implies that an enormous number, Perhaps over 90% of the circulating stories were considered unreliable or fabricated by the collectors themselves.
Why so much fabrication?
Well, think about the context then. By the 8th and 9th centuries, you have powerful Islamic empires, the Umayyads, then the Abbasids. They needed laws to govern vast territories. Different political factions, families, and regions often had vested interests in promoting certain interpretations or practices. Attributing a saying or action to the prophet was the ultimate way to legitimize a legal ruling or political stance.
So competing political groups might have promoted or even invented hadith to support their own power or legal interpretations.
That's precisely what many historical analyses suggest. The compilation of hadith, while a work of religious scholarship, was also deeply intertwined with the political project of consolidating power and defining law within the early Islamic empires. The debates over hadith authenticity were, in part, political debates about the direction of the empire.
So across all three, even when the core text was relatively stable, the process of interpretation and application became a site of significant human influence, often driven by political needs, survival, imperial unity, legal governance.
That seems to be the pattern the sources reveal, yes. The need to govern, to create stable societies, inevitably led to human systems of interpretation that shape how the original divine message was understood and lived out. Political centralization often drove theological or legal centralization.
It's really striking. The biggest divergences seem to lie not so much in what Moses, Jesus, or Muhammad originally conveyed, those core messages of monotheism, justice, revelation, but in that gap between the message and the fixed text. And then even more profoundly, in how subsequent human institutions, often tied to state power, interpreted and applied those texts over centuries.
I think that's a very accurate summary of what emerges from this kind of textual and historical analysis. The human element, the need for order, the realities of power, the passage of time, leaves an undeniable imprint.
Which brings us to a final thought, maybe something for you, the listener, to really chew on. We've seen that these interpretive layers, Talmud, creeds, hadith, were arguably necessary. They allowed communities to survive, empires to function, laws to be applied. They translated transcendent ideas into practical reality.
A necessary function, perhaps?
But we've also seen how this very process introduced divergence, human bias, and political agendas. So the question becomes, what does this unavoidable tension tell us about the challenge of applying any foundational text, any core set of ideals, to the messy business of human governance and society without fundamentally altering the original message in the process?
It highlights the perpetual balancing act, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Between staying true to the source and making it work in the real complex world, especially when power and politics are involved. How much interpretation is necessary adaptation, and when does it become distortion?
A question with no easy answers, I suspect. We hope this deep dive encourages you to think critically about the history and transmission of foundational texts, whatever they may be.